Welcome in this video of the House of Asian Cinema. Following the death of Park Chung-hee, a certain confusion settled at the head of South Korean state. Kim Jae-gyu failed to rally the necessary support around him to seize power and was eventually arrested. Prime Minister Choi Kyu-ah was named interim president. But on December 12, 1979, it was Chun Do-won, a major general belonging to Park's entourage, who had managed to avoid the recurring purge of the regime, who made a coup to become the new strongman. A second coup in May 1980 allowed him to become the new dictator at the head of the government. His seizure of power sparked protests across the country. It was in Gwangju, in the southwest of South Korea, that the most dramatic events of the period took place. In this video, we will see how cinema has handled this major step in the country's democratic struggle. On the morning of May 18, 1981, students gathered in front of one of Gwangju's universities. They were protesting against the seizure of power by Chun Do-won and the extension of martial law to the whole country. Troops preventing their entry into the establishment, the students began a sit-in, chanting anti-government slogans. The troops eventually intervened with batons and bayonets. The students evacuated the scene but resumed their demonstration in the center of the city in the afternoon. Again, government troops intervened violently. The next day, new demonstrations took place in the morning, and once again the repression was violent. Except that this time, Gwangju citizens of all ages joined the students and in turn suffered repression. A sign of events to come, some demonstrators began to defend themselves. On May 20th, thousands of citizens took to the streets. The cycle of demonstrations and increasingly violent repression reached its climax on the 21st with more than 50 deaths. In reaction, the public decided to fight back and a People's Army was created. It drove back the government troops and captured the provincial headquarters that same evening. A commune was established and submitted a list of 6 demands to the government to lay down their arms, including the release of all those imprisoned during the events and an amnesty for the others. The negotiations lasted 5 days, during which the city returned to normal activity under the supervision of the new authorities. As talked near closure, dissension within the city committee derailed the potential deal, and on the morning of the 27th, the army invaded the city. After a short struggle, they retook the prefectural building, thus putting an end to the revolt. The official toll was 170 dead and 380 wounded. Today, it is estimated that the real figures would be closer to 500 dead and 3,000 injured. If, as we will see later, many films dealt with the events of Gwangju through flashbacks, those which directly approach the subject are quite few, since there are only 2. The first, May 18, was produced in 2007. Directed by Kim Ji-hoon, it follows several inhabitants of Gwangju in their daily activities a few days before the outbreak of the events, and then from May 18th until the takeover of the city by the army. The 2007 film recreates with satisfying realism the repressive crescendo and public counter-reaction that took place during the month of May. Efforts are also made to explain the violent reaction of the army. Time shortcuts are present. We go from May 18th to May 21st without transition, as well as a certain over-dramatization, but on the whole, the events are rather respected and the film allows us to have a fair idea of what happened in the city. Unfortunately, Kim Ji-hoon partially betrays this good work with the addition of overly comical characters, completely out of step with the general tone of the work. 생긴 거 본게 물어본 나가 경솔이었다. 미안하지. and pompous speeches which illustrate more how Gwangju is seen today than the state of mind of the inhabitants of the time. Choices that unfortunately pulled May 18 down. 10 years later, it was filmmaker Jong-un who showed some interest in the subject with his A Taxi Driver. The film is based on the work of Jürgen Inspeter, a West German journalist based in Asia who worked for the public broadcaster ARD. He managed to enter the city on May the 20th and film the repression of the demonstrations, the climate of the city under the Popular Committee, and the final armed intervention. He was thus able to publicize the tragic events that were taking place in the southwest of the country internationally. His footage was then projected by a small South Korean opposition group during the rest of the military dictatorship, undermining the legitimacy of Chun Doo-hwan's power. The German journalist was accompanied by a taxi driver, Kim Sa-bok. It is this relationship that is at the heart of the film, in addition of course with the description of the events in Gwangju. The film focuses on the reporter's first visit on May 20th and offers a relatively short but even more immersive reenactment of the protest compared to May 18. Song Kang-ho brings his usual Mr. Everybody charisma and represents the awakening to the repression of the dictatorship, he who at the beginning was rather opposed to the student demonstration. It depicts the idealized journey of South Korea uniting against the dictatorship. If the humor is again present, it is better integrated into the story than what Kim Ji-yoon proposed in 2007.
Tell him, not me. Very, very important paper, okay?
Jong-un unfortunately cannot help but inflate the adventure, partially harming the realism of the enterprise. If the few Korean filmmakers who have tried to tell the events of Gwangju directly have managed each time to offer credible reconstructions of the events, they have also been systematically compromised by the commercial factor, whether adding a big dose of comedy or adding shifts and turns. The filmmakers seem not to have complete faith in the dramatic power of the subject or the interest that local audience could have in these events. We can regret it, especially in view of the authentic human tragedy represented by these few days of May 1980. During the rest of the military dictatorship, the authorities continued to repress participants in the event of May 1980, while maintaining that it had been a law enforcement operation against a communist rebellion. The democratic transition to a civilian government and then the accession to power of Kim Dae-jung fundamentally changed this narrative. Under Kim Young-sam, the government instituted May the 18th as a day of national remembrance, passed a law to exonerate certain leaders of the movement, and built memorials. A foundation to help the victims was also set up. Gwangju is now consecrated as a center of South Korea's democratic struggle. This recognition has not, however, completely erased the suffering experienced by those who lived through the events. Psychological or physical trauma, discrimination, and financial difficulties are still today the lot of many citizens who participated in the demonstrations. Perhaps because Korean filmmakers are particularly sensitive to this reality, talking about the events of Gwangju through its consequences on individuals in modern Korea is their preferred narrative device. Regularly, starting from the early 1980s, directors will use this type of story, each time applying an approach responding to different genres: comedy, horror film, revenge film. From 1980, therefore, it was Park Kwang-soo who initiated the phenomenon with his Black Republic. We follow a young activist forced to hide to escape the police. He is regularly assailed by flashbacks of real urban guerrilla warfare, an obvious reference to what had happened in Gwangju 10 years earlier. Lee Jong-kook approached the same subject the year after with his Song of Resurrection, a work unfortunately difficult to view today. Jung Sung-woo continued in this direction in 1996 with his A Petal. Having participated in the student movement during the period and spent some time in prison for his activism, the subject was close to the heart of the filmmaker of the excellent The Age of Success. In A Petal, based on a short story published in 1988, we follow a young girl traumatized by the events of May 1980, who becomes attached to a poor and abusive worker. At the same time, 4 students, former friends of her deceased big sister, are looking for her. The feature film takes up some tropes that characterized South Korean auteur cinema of the 70s and 80s through wandering characters living in a poor environment. But the many flashbacks evoking the repression which are sprinkled throughout the film, using different cinematographic techniques, bring considerable dramatic intensity. These different sequences vividly reproduce the horror and chaos of repression. Their strength is further heightened by the impressive performance of Lee Jung-yoon in the lead role, gripping in her complete surrender to portray the madness of her character. Lee Chan-dong continued in the footprints of Jung Sung-woo in 1999 with Peppermint Candy, the story of a man traumatized by his participation in the government repression of Gwangju, which will finally push him to suicide. The director complicates his narration via an inverted chronology, going from his death to the origin of his trauma. The exercise is skillful, making it possible to keep the viewer's attention more intensely than via a classic narration. In addition to the Gwangju Massacre, Lee revisits other traumatic moments suffered by the country, ranging from the end of the dictatorship to the financial crisis of the late 1990s. In doing so, he points above all to the culture of violence and dehumanization prevalent during the period of military government, source of the loss of innocence and morality of part of the population, symbolized here by the character of Kim Yong-go. Gwangju is shown in a surprisingly sober way and only through the gaze of the soldiers involved, a relatively original angle in the corpus of films linked to the events. These different narrative choices make Peppermint Candy a very unique work. Jong Yoon-chul chose a rather delicate angle in 2008, that of comedy. In A Man Who Was Superman, star Wang Jung-min plays a positive alter ego from the girl of a petal, a man traumatized by the events of May 1980 who thinks he is Superman and tries to help everyone he meets. Adopting a structure close to romantic comedy, a fact supported by the presence of a burgeoning relationship between Wang and Jenna June, the film has more difficulty than its predecessors in finding the right tone between optimistic naive comedy and drama. If the empathy toward this wannabe Superman is indeed present, the omnipresent good feelings slow down the dramatic force of the trauma of Gwangju and reduce its significance in modern Korea, especially since the directors do not exploit as much as one might have expected the paradox between fantasy and reality that the character experiences. Made in 2012, the adaptation of manhwa 26 Years stands out compared to the other films dealing with the consequences of the Gwangju Massacre. Unlike the other films mentioned, the trauma is not used as a revelation but as a plot starter. The use of animation to describe the event is also quite memorable compared to the other films and allow a fairly striking degree of graphic violence. Proof of the passage of time, most of the protagonists were very young children during the events. Adopting the popular motive of revenge, they decide to join forces to eliminate the person responsible for the massacre, former President Chun Doo-hwan. Cho Keun-yoon's film, while highlighting the violence of the events of May 1980, emphasized the responsibility and inhumanity of the former dictator, who indeed never showed regret for the repression. Having a physical embodiment of the cruelty of the dictatorship, while Chun was still alive and well at the time of the film's release, intensifies its dramatic impact. In addition, the director adopts the right tone, applying both the codes of action thriller and melodrama for a work that managed to entertain the viewer while making him reflect on recent history. While attempts to tackle the events of Gwangju head-on led to mixed results, those more indirect regularly managed to find the right tone to highlight the impact of the repression of May 1980. However, what stands out the most from these works is finally less the influence of the event on the democratic fight, how these events handicapped the military dictatorship and contributed to the political transition, but more the suffering of the victims, an empathy which is to the honor of the filmmakers, but which is partially reductive on the meaning and the implication of this tragic week of May 1980. There is still more to say on the subject, and there is little doubt that other filmmakers will pay attention to it in the future. If Chundu-1 had to deal with the terrible responsibility of the Gwangju Massacre during his entire presidency, it was another event that took place 7 years later that put a definitive end to his ambition to become a new Park Chung-hee. This event is the democratic demonstrations of June 1987, which we will see in the next video.